We come to section 96. 96 deals with hypochondriac patients. Many times you come across patients who are very anxious, very worried about their own suffering and how they are suffering in their life. And many times they will give an exaggerated expression of their suffering. If you see 96, the so-called hypochondriacs and other persons of great sensitiveness and impatient of their sufferings, they want to be relieved very quickly, portray their symptoms into vivid colors, and in order to induce the physician to give them relief, describe the ailments in exaggerated expressions. So they give an exaggerated expression of how they are. And so lots of anxiety, and lots of coloring up, not fabricating I'll say, but just portraying it into vivid colors. That's an important part of hypochondriacs. And Hahnemann says that this hypochondriac behavior is in itself an important factor for prescribing. So whenever they're anxious, whenever they're being very impatient, that impatience, that hypochondriac anxious nature is an important part of your totality which you cannot ignore. In the footnote of 96, third or fourth last line, this very exaggeration of their expression when talking of their ailments becomes of itself an important symptom in the list of features of which the portrait of the disease is composed. So this exaggeration, this impatience must be a part of your totality, because that is a characteristic, that is a nature, that is a disposition of the patient which you cannot ignore. So that's about 96. Now section 97 is dealing with indolent patients. Now who are indolents? Indolents are people who do not give much symptoms. You are either lazy or you'll find very less symptoms from them. Other individuals of an opposite character, partly from indolence, partly from a kind of mildness of disposition, or false modesty, shyness, or weakness of mind is just I cannot remember, refrain from mentioning a number of the symptoms, describe them in vague terms, or allege some of them to be of no consequence. So either they mention few symptoms or mention it vaguely, and perhaps you'll think it's a one-sided disease. But again, that indolent nature, that lazy nature, that sluggish nature is again an important part of the totality which you cannot ignore. So that's also quite important in prescribing. Come to section 98, please. One of the important factors about 98, and which I follow very rigorously in practice, is always hear something from the patient. Many times the patient does not visit you, the friends or the family come with the reports and with the symptoms, and it will give you many times an improper picture of the disease. So always, even if the patient is imbecile, even the patient is paralytic, always make sure you look at the patient or you spend some time with the patient, because either you observe it or the patient says something that's an important part of your totality. Section 98. Now, as certainly as we should listen particularly to the patient's description of his sufferings and sensation, and attach credence especially to his own expression, wherewith he endeavor to make us understand his ailments. So you have to listen to the patient, because in the mouths of his friends and attendants they usually altered and erroneously stated. Many times the friends and family can give you an erroneous picture of the disease. So always make sure you hear it from the horse's mouth, hear it from the patient's mouth, so that you can decide for yourself which is true, which is untrue. So that's also a very important factor which is important for case taking. So these are the practical aspects of case taking. 100 to 102, I'm not sharing that because it deals more with epidemic and sporadic disease. You may not always have an opportunity to have that. Section 104, please, the last section of the case taking part. 104. 104 deals with record keeping. Now many times I've seen homeopaths do this, give out a prescription to the patient, just at the corner of it write a few lines about the details of the case. That's a very bad thing to do, because you need to have a proper case record of what are the details of the case, so that you can look back at later on, you can strike out some of the symptoms, you can add new symptoms. Writing it on the prescription with a few lines, it's a totally wrong thing to do. Many times the patient loses it, don't have any details or any remembrance of the case record. So always make sure you make a detailed case records You may not give that to the patient, you may not print it, but at least maintain a logbook and register where you have the detailed information about the patient. 104. When the totality of the symptoms especially mark and distinguish the case of disease, when the picture of the disease is once accurately sketched, the most difficult part of the task is accomplished. So, getting the totality, the difficult part of the task is accomplished. And if you see the last line, or third last line of 104, he needs only to strike out the list of symptoms noted down at first visit, those that have been ameliorated, to mark what still remain and add any new symptoms. So remove, add, and note down what still remains. So record keeping is a very important part of a case taking. So that's about few excerpts from the organon. I'll share with you a few very interesting things from different authors about case taking which are practically important. I shared with you a few about leading questions and about how to deal with during case taking. Few other important factors which I like to share. This is by Stuart Close, Purpose of Case Taking. Stuart Close mentions the purpose of homeopathic examination is to bring out the symptoms of the patient in such a way so as to permit the comparison with the symptoms of the metromedica for the purpose of selecting a similar or homeopathic remedy. So I emphasized earlier also it has to be simple language. The purpose of case taking is you compare the symptoms of the patient with the symptoms of the metromedica. As I mentioned, it's a statements of simple people in simple language. You have to match them. Whenever you're doing case taking, my friends, especially beginners, always make sure the questions you ask, they are not stupid questions. Always ask questions with which you find a correspondence in your metromedicas, in your repertories. So ask a question which is related with the rubric, ask a question which is related with your materia medica. You're not there to give counseling sessions, you're not there to give, sympathy sessions. You're there to find out a correct remedy, so your questions should be exact, which correspond to remedies, which correspond to symptoms of the metromedica or rubrics in the repertoire. This is not my words. Again, Pierre Schmidt, Art of Interrogation. He mentions the questions to be asked with which we find a correspondence in our metromedicas and repertoire, and this is very, very important practically as well. Few other important factors which also is quite important. Again, we come back to Margaret Tyler, different ways of finding a remedy. And here Margaret Tyler mentions that the greater the value of a symptom for diagnosis, the lesser is its value in selection of a remedy. So if you are hell-bent on finding what is the diagnosis, what is the disease name, like conventional practitioners do, you lose out. Many times my family and my success for being a successful practitioner or a busy practitioner is we do not spend the headache that what is the diagnosis, what is the medical diagnosis, forget about it. What are the symptoms we have? Can we arrive at a therapeutic diagnosis? Can we arrive at the remedy diagnosis? That's more important. So do not waste time in finding out what is the disease, because that will not help you in coming up with the remedy. It can many times, if it's pathological cases, but most cases where there is functional symptoms, you need to find the therapeutic diagnosis rather than a pathologic diagnosis. Again, coming back to Pierre Schmidt, he mentions very interestingly, whenever you're doing case taking, patient has come to you for a headache, keep always the questions on the mental symptoms in between. If you ask them at the end, the patient is too tired and you'll think you're asking irrelevant questions. Why are you asking questions about his mind? Because they have no connection with his disease. If you ask them in the beginning, you'll think you're getting it all wrong. You come for a headache, you're thinking of it as a mental case. So do not put it at the beginning, do not put it at the end, put it in between where he will not be surprised nor will he be too tired. So that's also quite important for case taking. Elizabeth Wright, know the patient. Again, a very interesting thing which I still follow. Many times you have thought about a remedy. I've shared with you earlier, do not ask questions thinking about a remedy in mind, but many times as humans we tend to falter and we'll think about a remedy. But do not jump, do not lead the patient to the answer you desire. Sometimes ask the opposite and observe his reaction. You're thinking of a remedy which is perhaps NATMU, and you're thinking, should I ask his desire for salt? And you ask the opposite, you don't like salt, do you? When you're at the final stages of your prescribing, you say, no, I love salt. So you're asking an opposite thing and you're observing his reaction. You're thinking of pulsage there and you're asked, do you like fresh open air? And you ask the opposite. You generally keep your doors and windows closed, don't you? No, I like to keep my doors and windows open. I love fresh open air. So ask the opposite, observe his reaction, and then many times you will be able to also come up with a prescription in such a case. So that's also an important factor which you should also remember for prescribing the case. And finally, you have to understand that you have to get generals in a case. If you get clear generals, clear mentals, clear functional characteristics, that is itself a good totality. Again, coming back to Margaret Tyler, different ways of finding a remedy. She closes her statement, you do not recognize your friends by counting their fingers and toes, but by think personal to themselves. Do not remember your friends, oh, he has 10 toes and 10 fingers. That's because that's common to every one of them. But you remember your friends by characteristics of them, by peculiar traits of them. So symptom, for a drug picture to be complete, does not consist of a string of little symptoms, but broad outlines of mentals, broad outlines of peculiar symptoms. My granddad used to say, whenever after a consultation, you feel like giving a hug to the patient, they're so timid, they're so nice, it's always pulsatile. So that's a broad outline. You do not have string of little symptoms, but at the end of the consultation, you're feeling like, I need to give him a hug, he's so nice, he's so timid, he's so gentle, and that's pulsatile. So that's a broad outline of the mental and peculiar symptoms which you cannot ignore. So I've shared with you the practical aspects of case taking, which are important practically. I'll share with you a few more peculiar things when we get time later on about how to implement that as well. Thank you very much. Hope you have enjoyed this and look forward to seeing you again. Long live Hanuman, long live homeopathy.